Thank you everyone so much for coming out. And if it wasn't for this event, I don't even know if I would have come on this Scandinavian book tour, so I really, really appreciate AD and Utmacht and everybody for bringing me here, and Litteraturhuset for hosting. So this was my PhD dissertation, and then I changed it into a more general book. It began as a research project. I've been curious about this for probably 20 years or something. I remember engaging in debates around this around the WTO protest back in 1999. But I decided to write about it as an entire book and doctoral dissertation, kind of as the Occupy movement was breaking apart. And in Seattle, it was kind of had a different character in every single place. And I was in New York the first morning, and I saw that. Visited a lot of different ones, but Seattle, where I live, I was there pretty much every day, and it was really intense. And then when we actually lost the camp that we were working on together, the very last day, within hours of having this shared project that the police repressed and took away from us, we started fighting with each other about this topic of nonviolence. And I was struck for one thing that it was really generational. It wasn't, not absolutely, but it was pretty stark that I'm 44, and kind of most people older than me felt really attached to this term nonviolence, and it seemed just common sense, almost crazy to question it. And a lot of people younger than me didn't understand what this attachment was. And the acrimony, of course, there was a sort of liberal and radical divide. The acrimony over that discussion made this group of people who'd taken all these risks and done all this fantastic action together over almost 3 months in this movement. Suddenly, within about 12 hours, we kind of despised each other across this divide, and people never spoke again. So I was like, what is it about this word? What is it about this topic? And the corollary of that is, why does it seem of decreasing relevance, especially to younger activists? And why have riots become sort of more constitutive of social movements since maybe, the last 5-10 years, sometime in that range? So that's what I'll be speaking to today. My talk is going to have 3 different parts. I kind of talk about the way that the context has shifted. I believe that we still use terminology from the kind of 60s and 70s wave of movements, at least in the United States. And yet our conditions are very different after 40 years of neoliberalism. So I try to trace how that affects the conditions that we're responding to. That's the first part. The second part is I kind of take a critical look at nonviolence and try to get what is going on with the different meanings of it, what the attachments are and what the distances are. And then the third part is sort of like what gets left out of nonviolence. What is it about rioting that has a power and appeal for our moment? So in its 2016 report, Global Riot Control Systems Market, 2016 to 2020, the market research firm Infinity Limited has some great news for investors who are thinking of putting their money into riot control technologies. By 2020, the overall riot control market in the United States is expected to exceed $2 billion, with the markets in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa growing at even higher rates. Quote, protests, riots, and demonstrations are major issues faced by the law enforcement agencies across the world, unquote, and current conditions are unambiguously predicted to further generate demand for riot control systems. Growing economic transformations in the Asia-Pacific region are predicted to produce changes that will boost demand for riot control systems there as well. Ours is a time of riots, without a doubt. Still, not long ago, protests in much of the world, particularly in the US and Europe, were gradually thought of as non-violent affairs. After the intensity of 1968 and the subsequent repression of armed revolutionary groups in the US, Europe, and Latin America, nonviolence seemed to have become a cornerstone of social movement common sense. Curious exceptions like the Zapatistas, Black Blocs, and the occasional urban riots seemed to be exceptions that confirmed the rule. Yet the time when nonviolence could be taken for granted has clearly come to an end. What happened? What is it that people say through rioting that went unsaid for so long? My goal in this book is not to advocate violence or to prescribe nonviolence. It is, in fact, to move beyond the politically obstructive dichotomy of these terms. If I'm successful, we will learn to hesitate when we use these words, to pause until we actually have a better idea of what we're talking about, or perhaps until we've managed to come up with some more helpful terminology. Why do the stakes seem so high? More often than not, we're not even sure what we're talking about when we debate nonviolence and rioting. This book, in its small way, hopes to add a bit more clarity to the discussion by helping us understand when rioting bodies enter the streets, what it is they are saying and how successful they are at articulating it. So as I kind of began, I was saying to you that I noticed that we were really using this terminology from a different era when material conditions were quite different than they are now. And to try to understand that, and I should tell you, by the way, I'm a rhetorician. I got my PhD in composition and rhetoric. So I'm interested in sort of the way that meaning transforms over time and in an interaction with social conditions. It's sort of like linguistic sociology. So I turned back to some of the documents of the previous generation, and particularly looked at the New Left. Had this document called the Port Huron Statement that in many ways a lot of people from that generation feel, and I apologize, my presentation is very US centric. I think a lot about Europe, but I wrote this predominantly about the US. Though I think largely it applies to Europe. We can look at that in the Q&A. But the Port Huron Statement was written in 1962 by Students for Democratic Society, and it kind of summed up a lot of the passions that brought people into the movement and the convictions that drove the protests of the 60s and 70s. I was struck in reading the Port Huron Statement by this passage. So just listen to this passage and kind of think about that time and this time. Quote, "Many of us began maturing in complacency. As we grew, however, our comfort was penetrated by events too troubling to dismiss. Not only did tarnish appear on our image of American virtue, not only did disillusion occur when the hypocrisy of American ideals was discovered, but we began to sense that what we thought had originally thought of the American Golden Age was actually the decline of an era." Can you imagine anyone saying that in 2017, right? It's crazy. It's like, oh, we thought that we thought the world was this beautiful, perfect place. And then suddenly we were shocked to see, the dogs attacking the civil rights protesters in Birmingham or Selma, and they're shocked. But I can't imagine anybody after about the age of 4 in the world right now feeling like that. I can't imagine people being shocked to discover in their, teens or early youth that the world is an imperfect place, and that having a shaping influence on their politics. I also looked at Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, during a lot of that time. He gave this speech called The Great Society. And in The Great Society, he sort of says, we're only as high up as the ones at the bottom. We're only as advanced in history and in our progress as we are as the people who are at the very back of the line. And I mean, today, if you say this, I think even in, relatively social democratic Norway, it sounds kind of like anarcho-communism. It doesn't sound like the president of the United States. Things have changed in a way that the Constitution and the sort of justification, the rationale that the state gives forth that it's based on has shifted radically. And so the way that people challenge it also has to shift radically. So I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I did a kind of inquiry about, what are the constitutive parts of the neoliberal state that are different than the state that was being faced by the previous generation. First of all, I want to look at, this for me is like the Bible of social movements. It was written about 1976. Frances Fox Piven is still around, and her husband at the time, Richard Clower, is not. But they have this theory about what social movements are good for and kind of what they're not. And they talk about, if you're excluded from the channels of power, if you don't have a cousin in parliament, or if you don't have a way to mobilize a lot of votes on your behalf or something, traditionally, if you're poor or marginalized population, you have one way to have your influence within all systems of government, including democratic, representative ones, and that's through disruption. Disruption is kind of the measure of the power of people who are excluded from channels of power. It's their way to kind of force their way in, or our way. It's interesting because a lot of the time activists kind of debate about if something's revolutionary or reformist or whatever. It actually kind of doesn't matter in the Piven and Cloward framing, because what matters is people's ability to mess things up, to kind of interfere with the daily reproduction of production. And so what happens is sometimes that happens in a context where elites and the state are able to give concessions that then calms people down and they stop disrupting, and then it kind of returns to that. Sometimes it's smashed through brutal repression, and sometimes it ends up in a revolution if the current system doesn't give those concessions and people keep insisting. So a key term that's kind of going to be underlying a lot of this argument is disruption, because it's sort of the appropriate way of disrupting the very complicated ways our society reproduces itself shifts from moment to moment. And we have opportunities and windows to enact disruption at a certain time that then 24 hours later don't work anymore. And so a lot of the drama of movements versus elites fighting for resources happens through this term of disruption. So looking back with that proviso, these are all, by the way, from Black Lives Matter protests in Oakland, where protesters shut down the freeway like daily for about 2 weeks. So I picked up this paper. It's actually got my favorite title in an academic. Sorry, I'm going to go back to here. It has my favorite title of an academic paper. It's called. It was by this historian named Michael Katz, Journal of Urban Studies, and the paper is called "Why Don't American Cities Burn Very Often?" It's like, that's a good question. I like that title. And he looks at these 5 different indexes of things that have shifted under neoliberalism. One thing he says is that the conditions that caused the large waves of urban riots in the 60s and 70s have not improved. They've gotten worse. So it's not that the motive and the frustration that even the government was admitting in the 60s. It was doing all these government reports and saying people have no option but to riot. The congressional reports were saying this. They were saying there's 2 Americas and people are acting very rationally by rioting given their conditions. Those conditions have not improved. What's changed is the means of disruption have been kind of sabotaged by systems of social control. So Michael Katz in this paper looks at 5 different ways that those have changed. I'm just going to touch on those really briefly because it affects the sort of argument. One is, he talks about indirect rule. It's a term taken from colonial governance, and it's found a lot of the time when there's, for example, the British in India, when there's too much conflict happening in the colonies, it can kind of bring down the conflict to have local representatives that look more like the subject populations. And people feel more represented by them, even if they don't necessarily have executive powers. You can see in this, you can tell who's in control, but the uniforms are shared out. This same process has happened, again, I'm talking mostly about the United States. We've had President Obama, of course, being black, and a lot of chiefs of police or mayors of a lot of towns since the civil rights movement have been more diverse. In Seattle, we have a gay mayor, and the mayor who's coming in is likely to be elected next as lesbian. So there's a lot of local representatives sort of closer to the ground that kind of look like marginalized populations. But it doesn't necessarily mean they've had access to decision-making leverage. So Katz talks about at state levels where a lot of budgeting decisions are made, the constituency looks a lot the same. So one thing that's happened is that without elites actually changing their composition all that much, they've kind of looked more diverse in their representatives. Consumerism has been a huge shift. It's hard for us to kind of look back and remember how different things were in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the Fordist era, but a big part of the neoliberal era has been that as real wages have declined, credit has kind of substituted for those, and also the enslavement through sweatshops and over a lot of third world manufacturing has made a lot of goods very cheap. So a lot of the frustration, especially for kind of individual liberation that was being articulated in the New Left, has been funneled through easier ways to buy things. Of course, in 2008, that sort of collapsed as investors realized they weren't going to get paid back the money they were loaning out. So that sort of hope for future prosperity has kind of sort of maybe at a crisis stage. Another thing they talk about is the role of nonprofit organization. Non-governmental organizations. In the U.S., we usually say nonprofits, but they're sort of equivalent. They're really. I don't have anything to add to what this excellent book says that I highly recommend by the Insight Collective. The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, but they really show that a lot of the symbols and the organizations and the kind of forms of organization that were used to enact disruption in the 60s and 70s in previous generations have been turned into, by being turned into non-governmental organizations, they become accountable to the funding cycle. And groups like the Ford Foundation, owned by former Nazi member Henry Ford, begun by him and his family to kind of polish over their record, they're very happy to fund a lot of progressive social change organizations. But the problem is that social change organizations, as they're thinking of the future grants, have to think about what will be fundable and what won't. And over time, that has a really eroding effect on the willingness to be disruptive, even while the same symbols, the same personalities, the same language and sort of scene culture kind of adheres to it. The willingness to mess things up is kind of gone. Another thing that cannot be overestimated, that's changed incredibly, is the role of, the role of police. And it's interesting, I spent like 10 pages tracing this. There's such a generation gap, at least when I started to write this, between how younger and older people view the role of police. And even older leftists a lot of the time will sort of say, well, the police, there's tension around them because, they're because of economic inequality or unequal access to jobs or something. There was a great study after the Ben Lia riots in Paris, 11, 12 years ago, where youth were interviewed about, everybody in the neighborhoods were interviewed about the reasons for the riots. And older folks were like, it's unequal access to jobs, or the transportation to the center of Paris is really bad, or, these racist attitudes among the French, it's really personally humiliating. So, and none of them said police as their first reason. Those were all the reasons. Among youth, it was like 85% said police were the reason for the riots. So there's a stark generational gap. When I started writing this, I really had to do a lot of explaining to that, but I think it's come out, especially in the US with the Black Lives Matter movement, how much police are themselves, together with the kind of prison industrial complex, the carceral state, they are themselves a production point for inequality and especially racism. So that's now much more in the consciousness. But that's kind of a new form. In a way, that's been part of policing forever, but in a way, it's got an intensity in the late neoliberal era that it never had. And then finally, any of these things, of course, people have written a lot of books on, so I'm just kind of touching on them. The role of the media and the constitution of the media, this is a nice Black Lives Matter protest in Seattle where we shut down freeways. And I'm right there. That was a nice day. So police. And then, lastly, the role of media has really changed starkly since the 60s and 70s and the constitution of them. We look back, and Time magazine had reporters in the trenches with American soldiers in Vietnam and was documenting as they were executing civilians and napalming villages. And that was, of course, a big part of why the majority of the American population was horrified by the Vietnam War and ultimately, together with militant courage in Vietnam, globally put an end to it. We don't see that anymore, right? Reporters, if they're covering U.S. military action, they have to be embedded. They have to have privileged access and be approved. Chelsea Manning, was put into, I'll start with this part. In 1970, there was an employee of the CIA named Daniel Ellsberg who leaked this huge document called the Pentagon Papers that showed what the U.S. military was actually doing in Vietnam in their internal conversations. And it was the front page of like the New York Times, Washington Post, every day for like weeks. It was interesting because the FBI was raiding these big newspapers and saying you can't have it anymore. So they would just go to the next newspaper over, and that newspaper would put it on their front page that day. A lot of courage shown, even if there were still corporations, they were still owned by the capitalist class, but there was a little more kind of diversity in ways that we just don't see anymore, with much more concentrated ownership in like 5 companies' hands. So the most stark, I spend some pages on this, but the most stark difference I found, this picture was kind of one of the most essential images from the civil rights era. This woman is named Elizabeth Eckford, and she was one of the Little Rock Nine that integrated Little Rock Central High School. And you can see the reaction of the white students at the school. They want to murder her. The presence of the media, of this photographer there, actually saved her life. There had been lynchings in that neighborhood of black folks who tried to integrate into white institutions, and they've been killed. But I think this photograph and the others and the presence of media and their presence and courage is what saved her. And she's still alive. She's like, whatever, 94 or something. So, as we look at media now with some frustration and cynicism, it's important to look back at a time it actually was a really central, important tool and how it worked like that. So this is, for me, this image really captures, I think, of the photographer standing in the middle of this like homicidal white crowd to make sure that Elizabeth Eckford, this young black student's story, is told. I'm not sure that would happen anymore. Starkly, as I was doing this research, I found out in one little story, that her son was killed by police in 2003, and I couldn't find a picture of him. It didn't get any coverage at all. It's normal, right? It's not a story anymore. She, in front of that white mob in one region of the country, attracted national attention, but the death of her son at the hands of police is so routine. I just found it as a curiosity in one paper that was like, oh yeah, she was famous, her son just died. Not even worth telling. So that to me speaks of the way that issues and the way that the structure of the media has changed in a really fundamental way that puts activists in a different challenge. So kind of wrapping it together, overall what I kind of take from these changes, and this is me, not Katz, is that the neoliberal state doesn't really, thinking again about how strange those words sounded about like the loss of innocence, we thought our country was perfect, how silly that sounds in 2017. And I think what happens is the neoliberal state doesn't care at all about justice, about presenting justice. And again, Norway's a little weird, so maybe like the ideas of a social, to the extent that there's still social democratic influence and whatever here, like makes it not quite as severe, but certainly the shift in the neoliberal elements from the kind of welfare state elements, really starkly, it does, like current conditions don't really care if we think it's like fair or not. And so I think a lot of the assumptions that we have about protest, where we're asserting justice or injustice, if something's like good or bad or fair or not fair, they're kind of ridiculous in the face of current conditions, because I don't think anybody expects the neoliberal state to be fair. If you tell Donald Trump that it's not fair to ban refugees, or like racism's not fair, they know that, right? He knows that, and it's not going to have any effect. What has an effect now is leaving aside, of course, we talk about justice with each other. Of course, it's important for us to think about justice. But in public protest and performances, what matters is power. What matters is control of public space, and who can assert what. And can we get away with things? Is there still room for action? Do we still have agency? That's where I think the shift has happened, is from the state has moved from the sort of axis of justice to the axis of just control, and that means movements have to follow along and do that same, respond in turn. Okay, end of part one. So now I'm going to kind of look at this whole history of nonviolence and how that interacts with the present moment. One of the things for my research, I read, I don't know, 100 books or something, and I interviewed probably about 50, a lot of people who were kind of veteran nonviolence advocates and even trainers, and then a lot of younger people who were participants in some of the riots that were happening. By the way, I didn't ask anybody, did you riot? Because the FBI was studying the same thing I was at the same time, so I didn't want to know too much about that stuff. But I did say, so when you're around this, what was your impression? And one thing, though there's this really intense opposition that I was telling you about, that kind of tore movements apart and continues to, I'm going to start out with some of the surprising things that I found that were actually in common with people when they thought they were opposites. One is that for a lot of the older participants who are really attached to this, and the younger ones too, for people who are really attached to this idea of nonviolence, when they sort of would panic about the idea of leaving it aside, they would always talk about guns. They would say, you can't attack the state with guns. You can't attack the power with guns. They've got a lot more guns than they do. We're just going to get killed. The interesting thing is, and I think this comes from a trauma, because in the US, in Europe, in a lot of the world after 68, there was essentially kind of a wide-scale near revolution, right? In a lot of places it was quite close to actual revolution, like in black neighborhoods in the US. So people, and that was put down very violently. There were a lot of leaders who were assassinated, there were a lot of people imprisoned who are still in prison, and there were a lot of police infiltration of friendships, of communities that wrecked people's lives. So there's a lot of trauma there that's never been resolved. And I think for a lot of people, if they hear violence, they think about that armed struggle against the state that was kind of part of that last phase. And they're like, I don't want to go through that anymore. That's totally insane. The interesting thing is the younger people, the kind of riot kids, well, say, who were strongly disagreeing with nonviolence, were equally opposed to the presence of guns for the same reasons. This really surprised me, because the main thing that people thought that they were fighting about turned out to be not a fight at all. I'm going to read a passage from Frances Fox Piven, the same person who wrote that book earlier, that expresses the sentiment, sort of, I think, from everybody I talked to about this. She says, people power in the 20th century did not grow out of the barrel of a gun. It removed rulers who believed that violence was power by acting to dissolve the real source of their power, the consent of acquiescence of the people they had tried to subordinate. When unjust laws were no longer obeyed, when commerce stopped because people no longer worked, when public services could no longer function, and when armies were no longer feared, the violence that governments could use no longer mattered. Their power to make people comply had disappeared. So I heard this lot, well, I'm going to get back to this a little bit, but for people who believed in nonviolence as a way to really achieve social change and a new world, this was exactly their logic. And also, when I was asking people, as we'll hear about sort of in the third part, when I was asking people, what does riot do? What's the point? They would actually say basically exactly the same process. So the thing that people assumed was this dichotomy actually was very much in common. It would be nice to find out that actually everybody has everything in common and it was just a misunderstanding. Of course, that's not the case. So I went pretty in depth. I spent, I don't know, 100 pages on it in my book, looking at the kind of history of nonviolence. And I find some sort of interesting, I end up pretty critical about it while appreciating some of its power in certain moments. But I'm going to kind of now move to the, oh yeah, sorry, I want to explain this picture too. So these are from, when we're talking about like leaving aside guns and using sort of other types of violence, which is what I heard younger people talking about it. I talked to a British riot scholar, Roger Ball, and he's done some writing and was present for the poll tax riots, which are what these are pictures of. And he was saying, after 10 years of the most brutal neoliberal reforms in Thatcher's Britain, they're all been, union organizations have been really smashed. A lot of the traditional forms had sort of not managed to unseat her. And then finally, they went too far and they tried to put this tax into place that was like a tax on the poor. And what happened is it drew out something like 150, 200,000 people into the streets of London who were infuriated at the class war that she was enacting. And what they did was they enacted wide-scale violence that really smashed up London. But the thing is, the logic of the violence was, it was a lot of people who weren't experienced. They were just frustrated, and they'd walk by something and they'd kick over a newspaper stand, or they'd elbow a cop as they walked past them, or there were a few police cars turned over. But it wasn't a small core of people. It was evident in the kind of violence that it was this dispersed insurrectionary frustration. And if it had been a small number of people with guns on that kind of model, it'd be easy to say there's terrorists trying to overthrow the country and dismiss them, right? But the fact that it was such a huge part of the population doing a small amount of violence each ended up having a catastrophic effect on her reputation, and she had to resign in 1990. This is what finally brought Thatcher out. So the logic of those, the sort of Maoist, like armed struggle, revolutionary cells model versus more like the poll tax model, I think is underplaying a lot of this issue. So, coming back to what nonviolence means and what the problems are and why it might have an awkward relationship with our current moment. I looked at some of the definitions. As somebody who studies language, I started with looking at some of the definitions of what nonviolence means, which of course unavoidably has to involve what violence means, right? And I found an interesting pattern of like a sort of consistency of inconsistency in the way that people define nonviolence and its opposite. So for one thing, this guy, if there's anybody who's famous for being the intellectual of kind of strategic nonviolence, the kind of violence that's actually meant to change things and not just meant to make you feel better, is this guy, Gene Sharp. And he's done a lot of work, but most famously he did a 3-part series, The Politics of Nonviolent Action. And part 2 is The Methods of Nonviolent Action, which lists 198 different kinds of nonviolent action that can be used for social change. And when I read over these, it's very powerful. He has a lot of great ideas. It sounds like the kind of things that do work to change the world. He says that roughly you can kind of gather them together into 3 categories: demonstration, occupation, and strikes, work stoppages. So that's great. It sounds to me like those are some pretty powerful ways to change society. The problem is if you look historically at when those are enacted in contentious situations, they're never actually nonviolent. There can be a sort of inherent violence that doesn't come out. We've been talking about how in Norwegian history there's this sort of consent society, and a lot of the times there's just a present threat. But if there's a real challenge between somebody who owns a factory and the people who produce the labor the people who labor there that creates the wealth, that's not going to be resolved through consensus because they have opposing interests, right? There's a violence that keeps these relationships in power, and it ultimately takes a violence to challenge them. We don't always see it played out, but it's the presence of it in the background that gives things like strikes and demonstrations their potential to turn into riot, their power. So I find this definition kind of unconvincing because I have a lot of passages from scholars and people that are like, that's nice to say that strikes are nonviolent, they're just not. They might not be violent every time, but it's the potential for violence within them that actually gives them their power. Another definition that I found that just didn't really stick together, this guy George Lakey, he's another huge name in sort of nonviolence, and this is another kind of way of thinking about it that I critique. He talked about May '68 in Paris, and he said, that it was mostly nonviolent. You had initial clashes between students and police, and then the police cracked down, and then more students and youth and workers ended up coming out. There were millions in the street. And when there were millions in the street, there was no violence because the police didn't even try, or it was very minimal, only at the margins. It's silly, right? Because it was the violence of the confrontation that opened up the issue that was part of that process. It was an absolutely essential part of that process, even though by the time the balance of who was in the street came out, sure, you didn't need violence anymore, but it was an essential part of that process. So to focus on saying it was mostly nonviolent is nonsensical. I was thinking I didn't have this in the book, I was just thinking, in the meantime, it's like saying war is nonviolent because war is mostly not active violence. War is mostly people sitting around scared and bored in their homes, wondering what's going to happen to them. It's not actively most people getting shot in a whole huge region, right? But the presence of violence at the margin is what defines a situation. So I think it's equally silly to say that, that Paris '68 was mostly nonviolent. Finally, I'm going to come to this book. A lot of the, actually without exception, the kind of nonviolence trainers, professionals, people who've been doing this for a long time, all said, oh, you have to read this book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan. Erica Chenoweth is still getting sort of front page articles commenting on stuff in the Washington Post. She's a big name, very respected. She's a political scientist, and she did this study about sort of what's most effective for making social change. And she said that at first she thought it was going to be violence, and then when she studied it, she found out that nonviolence works much better. It works twice as well. which notably is not 100%, it's like 66 to 33%, but okay, fine. But bearing in mind my question about definition, I said, well, there's a hard question here. What is violence and nonviolence? If you're going to say it works twice as well, you're going to have some pretty firm categories if you're going to do a study about it. And indeed she does. So I look at her book, again, best-selling on this topic. And at the beginning of her book, she says just this. She says, here's what I mean by violence. Quote, violent tactics include bombings, shootings, kidnappings, physical sabotage, such as the destruction of infrastructure, and other types of physical harm of people and property. Okay, so that's what she's calling violence. Fine, you can measure that, right? You can look at if things were broken and people were hurt or whatever, if there were bombings. A page later, she talks about the data set that she used. She didn't do the primary research. She looked at this data set called the Correlates of War that has indexed 20,000 social conflicts and when people got what they wanted and when they didn't. So this is what she actually uses for her study. And a page later, she says, the Correlates of War data set requires all combatant groups to be armed and to have sustained 1,000 battle deaths during the course of the conflict, suggesting that the conflict is necessarily violent. Well, yes, if 1,000 people are killed with guns, I agree that that's violent. But that's not the same thing she said a page before, where she said injuring, the threat of harming property is violence. So the operational definition in this best-selling book is sliding all over the place in a really suspicious way. I think it's quite opportunistic, and we'll get to that in a second. But just notice the difference between her definition, that's quite wide open and including sort of threat and, say, breaking a window, and 1,000 people getting killed with guns. Very, very different phenomenon. So why does that matter? Well, one thing that bothers me in that kind of way of talking about things is it draws a moral equivalence between riot and war. And I'm not sure that the record justifies that if you look at history. So, for example, we said before that disruption, and riot is just one form of disruption. They're obviously not violent forms of disruption. But riot has been something resorted to by people when they have limited options, right? When they have limited access to power. So in US history, there's something like 10,000 recorded instances of riots for a variety of reasons. But you look back, for example, in the 20th century, the suffragettes in fighting for women to have the vote were known, if you look back at the newspapers, they were nearly synonymous with rioting at the time. These are some pictures. Oh, this is in front of the White House. They're burning stuff. Rioters! This is, I think, Britain. I love this, I just saw this today. The suffragette that knew jujitsu, and she's terrifying all these police, they're running away from her, right? So suffragettes were not, we look back at them and they're of course they were doing this thing that everybody knew was right, that women should have the vote. No, they were rioting because they had to create space for the consciousness of this issue, and it wasn't there. They had to make it through violence. I mean, violence against stuff at least. People sometimes, they assaulted Winston Churchill. So we forget that when we look at history, but this doesn't seem the same as war to me. Or now, recently, finally, gay marriage is legal at the federal level. We'll see if Trump tries to overturn it in the US, across, of course, a lot of Europe. It's legal. This all began in the late 60s, early 70s with a much less respectable form of riots. The first, in 1966, there was a riot in San Francisco at this cafeteria, Compton's cafeteria, and then most famously in 1969 in New York, the Stonewall riots were what brought consciousness to these issues, and it was actually police raiding trans bars, particularly where people were like, the police have to get out of here, and they asked the police to leave. The police didn't leave when asked, so they fought them, right? So this whole movement now that's very common sense for us, encoded in our laws and everything, began not so long ago as riots, and not at the hands of elites, right? As opposed to, of course, to war, right? War is the opposite. War is waged by elites with our lives against each other. We don't have much say in it. I mean, we can fight it, but it's not It's always made by the people who were most in control, the heads of state, economic elites. This one guy, Smedley Butler, wrote this book, War is a Racket, and he says it's not what seems to the majority of people. Only a small group knows what it's about. It's conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of very many, right? So part of what I'm saying is like riot is violence, right? War is also violence. That may not be the only thing that matters about them. And the differences may be just as important. So that seems like something to pause at that is lost in this equivalence that nonviolence draws. Great pictures. So I don't have time to go into it today, but in the book I really kind of trace the whole history of nonviolence. It goes back, I think, to the Quakers, who believed in this doctrine of non-resistance, and then the abolitionist movement in the US adopted sort of Quaker spiritual beliefs and applied them politically. And William Lloyd Garrison, most famously, was writing a lot about non-resistance for his own reasons. And then Leo Tolstoy was a big admirer of William Lloyd Garrison and took up that and developed a lot farther. And a lot of people don't realize that Mahatma Gandhi, his biggest influence, he said his biggest influence philosophically was Tolstoy. We always think like East and West are really far apart or whatever, but Gandhi said he owed his whole philosophy of nonviolence to Tolstoy. And then, of course, Martin Luther King to Gandhi. So Tolstoy has some interesting things to say about these things. But I found in a lot of his writings the same kind of suspicious drawing and equivalence thing. So I'm going to read you one passage where, so Tolstoy said that government is violence. Government is constituted, many others have said this too, right? Constituted by an essential act of violence, and it's the threat of violence that maintains the state. Tolstoy, as a Christian, felt like he had to be consistently opposed to violence, therefore opposed to the state. So he was actually openly an anarchist. Sounds pretty radical, sounds pretty threatening, in a time when there was a lot of conflict between activists of his environment and the Tsar. So in the midst of that, listen to this one passage that he writes about. He's kind of writing that everybody's mad at him for having his position on non-resistance. That's his word for nonviolence. He says, "The principle of non-resistance to evil by force has been attacked by two opposing camps. The conservatives, because this principle would hinder their activity in resistance to evil as applied to the revolutionists in persecution and punishment of them." So in other words, he's saying, the Tsar doesn't like it that I'm against violence because they want to use the violence against the revolutionaries. And the revolutionaries too, because this principle would hinder their resistance to evil as applied to the conservatives and the overthrowing of them. The conservatives were indignant at the doctrine of non-resistance, hindering the energetic destruction of the revolutionary elements. The revolutionists were indignant at the doctrine of non-resistance, hindering the overthrow of the conservatives, who were ruining the national prosperity, right? So clearly, he's saying they're equivalent. He's like, they hate me because I won't let them use violence to kill them, and they hate me because they won't let me use violence to get them, right? The weird thing is, like, just a minute ago, Tolstoy sounded a lot like them, and not at all like them. He was saying them, the Tsar, had to be overthrown, I thought, and he sounded a lot like the revolutionaries with this utopian project. But just when you're thinking he might be kind of taking a stance in a very risky situation, suddenly he says those two are morally equivalent. So that's the kind of move that I see popping up again and again in the history of nonviolence that I think we have to be very suspicious of. And that's consistent, that's not just in the neoliberal era. So fine and well, there are some problems that I think we need to look at a lot with our assumptions a lot of the time that nonviolence is the way to do stuff, or even that we know what we're saying when we say it. I also didn't want to just stay at this point where I'm like, yeah, that was a stupid little hippies or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Because there's clearly something at least called nonviolence has had a really powerful place in social change in a lot of places in the world in the 20th and 21st centuries, right? So I wanted to acknowledge that. There's a lot of like critiques of nonviolence before, like Peter Gelderloos or Ward Churchill, that kind of don't acknowledge that. They're just like, they're all stupid. And I don't think that's fair. So I spent a lot of time kind of delving in, talking to people, and also looking in the texts written by, the classics written by Gandhi and MLK and some of these others. And I was struck that there was a real difference in the way that the terms were being used in their context and that the way we hear them now. I came upon this one passage that I want to look at in Martin Luther King's early work, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. And when I read this, there was something about it that seemed different. So Martin Luther King says, "It must be emphasized that nonviolent resistance is not a method for cowards. It does resist. If only one uses this method because he is afraid, or merely because he lacks the instruments of violence, he is not truly nonviolent. This is why Gandhi often said that if cowardice is the only alternative to violence, it's better to fight." Oh, sorry, I'm going to move, so I'll be out of frame. So I'm an English teacher. So I can, I like to take out words and look at different ways to write something. And I took a long time looking at the sentence. And I'm trying to figure out, he's making a really big distinction between cowardice and being afraid and real nonviolence. How do you tell them apart? It's great that they're not the same thing. How can I tell the difference? Is it just somebody feels differently if they do the same thing, but they're like, this is really scary, but I'm doing it anyway? Then it's nonviolence, but if they're not, I don't understand what could, I was trying to figure out how can you tell them apart. And then I looked at this sentence, like I'm grading a student paper or something, and it says, "You cannot call yourself nonviolent merely because you lack the instruments of violence." And I freaked out. What he's saying there is you need the instruments of violence to be nonviolent. You need to be able to enact violence and have everybody know that you could go there in order to not go there. And the power of nonviolence in moments that, of course, King and Gandhi and a lot of other figures have used, and movements the powerful moments have been when there was the real palpable, concrete threat of violence happening, and everybody knew it, and they're like, you know what, we could do this. There's two ways to do this, but how about we don't do it that way? That's courageous, right? That's powerful because people see that there's, a real possibility, and then doing something else, shows your power in another, to another degree. It shows your control. You could do this thing, and you're so powerful you don't even have to. The potential for violence, I think, showed this is, after Martin Luther King's death, there were huge riots across the country. Nina Simone was on stage, the jazz singer, the night of King's death, and she's like, we're not about to be nonviolent anymore. So those show that inherent in the power of King's words was what made the nonviolence powerful was the threat, the very real present threat of violence. And I think I found this in King's correspondence everywhere. Once I knew what to look for, I found a telegraph that he sent to President John F. Kennedy, and he says, "I will continue to urge my people to be nonviolent in the face of bitterest opposition, but I fear that my counsel will fall on deaf ears if the federal government does not take decisive action. If Negroes are tempted to turn to retaliatory violence, we shall see a dark night of rioting all over the South." And then later in Letter to Birmingham Jail, he says, "A development that would inevitably lead to a frightening racial nightmare." Some people read this as King being hypocritical, that he's threatening with violence. I don't think he's being hypocritical. He means it. He doesn't want it to happen, but it's the very immediately real possibility of it happening that makes his ability to do something else meaningful and powerful. And so what I found in a lot of contemporary movements is when people talk about nonviolence, they don't have that other that they're disowning. They're just weak. And that doesn't, unfortunately, have a lot of power. So now I'm going to go to the third part, where I kind of try to figure out what it is that gets left out of nonviolence, particularly kind of why people in our time riot, why it's become part of staple responses for every nearly every large-scale social movement in the kind of late neoliberal era. So to think about our moment, I went way back to the works of John Locke, who is, if anyone, is kind of the ideological author of libertarian, of liberal capitalist ideology. And I was kind of looking through portions that would reflect on this, and I found this one portion in the second treatise on government that struck me as strange. He's talking about, kind of why you need the mediating state to keep people from kind of revenge, back and forth violence. And he says, thus a thief, whom I cannot harm, but by appeal to the law, for having stolen all that I am worth, I may kill. Sorry for the syntax, it's old. But I can kill a thief for having stolen all that I'm worth, when he sets upon me to rob me, but of my horse or coat. And then you have all these, because the law, which was made for my preservation, etc., permits me my own defense. And what strikes me as strange when I look at this is I'm talking about, how did a thief stealing your coat become a defense on himself, that he actually has the right to murder someone for it? It's a strange equivalence there. He starts by talking about his stuff and ends up talking about himself. And there's a lot of other passages like this. I trace a pretty funny one in Ayn Rand, who I think is probably the worst author ever. But there's this consistent thing it's strange because it's an equivalence of the stuff you have, commodities or whatever, and kind of your body and your own selfhood. We hear it reflected in Romance languages, like the word property relates to propre, which is like in French is sort of yourself, your ownness, right? Or even in English, we talk about own, your own self, but owning is also your deed of ownership. If like whoever has the deed to this building, we have to pay them rent. So it's really fixed in the basis of our way of thinking, of our worldview, that there's this kind of rough equivalence between our deepest selves, our identities, our soul, our bodies, and the stuff we have. And so much so that it's kind of hard to speak of it. So thinking of that, I'm trying to figure out what it is that riots are up to. I was particularly interested as one of the kind of touch-off points of this era where riots are a common part of protests. I was really struck and did a lot of thinking about the Greek uprising at the end of 2008 in Athens. I don't know how many of you remember this, but police walked into an anarchist neighborhood in Athens and shot and killed 15-year-old Alexis Grigoropoulos pretty arbitrarily. And then a video was released of the police just strolling out, kind of high-five, kind of joking around. Within hours, that neighborhood, which is like a seasoned left neighborhood, broke out in riots, which I don't think surprised anybody. But what did surprise everybody is, in the context of the economic collapse and other things happening, within a week, the riots had spread to basically every city in Greece, and had spread not just to sort of activists, but the entire youth, like high schoolers, junior high, college students. Everybody was out on the streets. And it was really violent. I mean, people were burning basically every ATM, every bank, every police station was either destroyed or severely harmed by fire and by physical attack. There were physical street confrontations with police. I'm not sure what to say about this. The Athens Christmas tree that's 80 meters tall or something was burned down, and this postcard was circulated. And it's really captured the moment. There was just such bitterness about, it was kind of like, you're just killing us, you can't have Christmas, right? You can't just go shopping and have all this if you're just walking in and killing us. So yeah, immense amounts of violence. What struck me thinking about it, that hadn't struck me originally when it happened. I was watching the TV constantly when it happened. But when I went back and thought about it, I was like, I never actually heard about anybody after Alexis was killed being seriously injured. There was huge street fights. I mean, there were fascists coming out. There was a lot of street fights going on, but there wasn't another death. And as far as I heard, there wasn't, I think people probably went to the hospital, but there wasn't any other critical injuries, or considering the scale of violence, And also like, I think we would have heard about if an officer was seriously injured, but for all the rage against the police and the street fighting against them, they have armor, they're prepared. None of them were seriously injured that I've ever heard of. So I kind of suspected that there was something different than the way we kind of usually talk about violence happening in this. And that was, I went to Greece and I was talking to people, and it was proved by something that happened a couple years later, a really tragic event, where the rage that had fed into that original uprising by 2010 had kind of generalized. A lot of adult workers were really furious about the corruption, the austerity programs, And so 2010, May Day, there was something like 200,000 people who came out to the streets on May 1st to show their rage. And they did. They lit everything up. They smashed out just tons of windows. They took out all this stuff. But something happened that day that usually doesn't happen. My friends explained to me that previously, when somebody Molotovs a building, if I see it on the news, you just figure somebody goes by and throws in a firebomb, right? But he said that would be crazy. You could just kill people if you did that. So what they do is they actually like walk up and they open the door and they're like, hello, anybody here? And they check the bathrooms and they check the closets and they're like, kitty, kitty, kitty. And they check there's no kitty cats hidden in the corners or whatever. And then they light it on fire because they don't want to hurt people. Who knew? I didn't know that. In 2010, a very painful thing happened. 2 bank workers were locked in a bank by their boss, who made them go to work that day, locked the door, and people Molotov the bank and killed the 2 bank workers. When there was actually a loss of life, the movement quit. The people I talked to, I think if this happened in the United States, people would be like, tough luck, people die every day. but the Greek anarchists that I was talking to had a very different feeling. All of them were like, I'm responsible for that. I killed those people. The fact that there was one person in the movement stupid enough to do that, that's my fault. And they quit. It put an end to the movement. And it's still sort of recovering now and taking different forms. Because it was the opposite. It was immensely violent, but it wasn't that kind of violence. And actually hurting people and killing people was the opposite from what they meant. So, in trying to figure out what's going on with this, we've got John Locke, we've got the Athens uprisings. Finally, what kind of brought it to me together was the uprising that happened around Black Lives Matter in Baltimore. Again, I don't know if you know this story, but there was a young black man, Freddie Gray, who was arrested by police on the street, and they arrested him pretty brutally, but he was still sort of healthy or whatever. Then they threw him in the back of a police van, and they did a thing that everybody knows about in Baltimore. I hadn't heard about it, but it's called a rough ride. And they drove the police van so fast, and they were screeching in corners and whipping the car, so that by the time he arrived to the police station, he had a broken neck, and he died within hours. People came out and were protesting, you can't just murder like this. And there was no response. There was like a week of peaceful protests, and people were like, we need the police held accountable, and nothing happened. And then after a week, people got kind of cornered downtown, young people, and it blew up into a riot, culminating in a lot of central buildings in the middle of Baltimore. I was just there, burning down. It was like this one big pharmacy. A lot of things, people burned down a lot of the main buildings in downtown and smashed a lot of windows. This hasn't happened in the US for like decades, so this was like, whoa, something's up. And I was following this every day, and I was struck by this thing that people were painting on the walls, and a lot of people who were interviewed were kind of saying the same things. They're like, yeah, you didn't notice till we started doing this. It's like you care more about broken windows than broken spines. It's an art piece somebody made based on that. And it struck me, that's what riot says. It's not just that that's something people say about riots. That's what riot articulates. Is this, back to that John Locke, that equivalency where property and bodies and lives are kind of the same thing. Well, what if they're not? How do you make that point? And riots, there's different kinds of riots. I'm kind of talking about anti-capitalist riots, anti-racist riots. They're a way of showing a disrespect. They're a way of saying maybe lives and stuff are not of equal value. Maybe stuff's not so important. And it's a way of performing disrespect for that property as they perform respect for bodies and for lives. Consistently, I looked at the figures for Italy in the 70s, the years of lead, and I think if you talk to most Italians, they would remember that as just this like kind of ongoing cycle of violence left and right, and everybody's being violent. People who studied it said that there was some crazy stuff, but basically 90% of the homicides and the actual physical against people violence was from the right wing, sometimes even framing the left, and then it turned out to be right wing. And most of the violence that the left was perpetrating was against stuff. So I think it's not surprising, right, if people are trying to present that capitalism is messed up because it doesn't respect life and it gives too much value to property. Riots are performance of the opposite. They're performance that maybe those two things, maybe you can actually really disrespect property and respect life that much more so. So that's, I didn't say this, in my book I have sort of 7 different things that I think riots say. That's the first one. I call it forcing comparisons. It makes us kind of admit where are our values. And you'll notice every time after there's a riot you have, I'm sure there's some conversations in Oslo, as they are where I'm from, where you have people say, well, why does it have to be violent? It's distracting from their point. And then somebody else says, well, it's just a window, it's not violence. And somebody says, of course it's violent, and it goes back and forth. The point of rioting is to make people have to figure that out and find words for it and argue about it and think about where their values lie. And that, that equivalence that Locke was saying is kind of unstated most of the time. Liberalism claims to be a humanist outlook, right? But this kind of is drawing it to its extremes and saying, is it, if this can happen to Freddie Gray? Okay, so that was one thing, the sort of forcing comparisons that I think is something that riot does. That's not the only thing. As I said, I found kind of 7 things. I'm going to tell you about 4 of them in this presentation. Another one I think of as profanation. And I just heard these terms in my interviews with people coming up a lot. People talking about sacred and profane, profanity. And I was trying to figure out what is going on with that. So I went back to Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, who looks at Roman law. And in Roman law, there was actually a technical definition for what is sacred and what is profane. The sacred is simply, so say you're having a bad winter and you're just like sick the whole time. And you just like have a stomachache every day, you have a headache, you keep getting a cold. And you're like, Zeus, can you stop already with making me sick? I'm tired of it, please. Zeus doesn't stop making you sick. And you're like, well, maybe Zeus wants to play some games on my cell phone. So you're like, okay, nobody uses a cell phone anymore. This is Zeus's cell phone. He's going to play phone games on it. And I hope he cheers up and it stops making me sick. So you're like, okay, don't anybody use this phone. It's sacred now. It's just for Zeus. And the definition, the legal definition in Roman law is when something's taken out of the circulation of human life, taken out of human use, reserved only for use by the gods. So long as it's only Zeus's phone and nobody's allowed to use it, it's like legally sacred, right? It's kind of beyond, outside of our world. Profanation, making something profane, is simply reversing that. So if I'm like, kind of getting bored, I haven't played my favorite phone game in a little while, I'm still getting a cold, don't anybody tell Zeus, but I'm going to take my phone back and start playing games on it. I'm profaning the phone. It's not sacred anymore because people are using it. It's like allowed into our world. So that's actually like the technical traditional meaning that we've inherited from that influence about sacred and profane. So I don't have time to kind of totally tie it in, but as I read you, I'm going to read you a testimony from somebody who's involved in riots in some of the stuff in Oakland. And just be thinking of those ideas of sacred and profane. Quote, sorry, misread. As far as this violence against property, there's of course these ridiculous cases of people who don't believe in damaging property, jumping on other people as they're trying to damage property and hitting them, choosing to injure another person in order to stop them, Not even their own property, right? But like corporate property, you know? To me, that's just, it speaks to me how, especially in the United States, how deeply that deification of property, corporate property is. And that actually, that attack on property, even if it's symbolic, because obviously we're not going to like hurt Wells Fargo enough with one window to drive them out of business, but the willingness to actually attack corporate property is one of the biggest taboos in this culture. It's like in the Spanish Civil War when people were digging, when the revolutionaries were digging nuns out of their grave or had firing squads for the crosses. This is essentially what we're looking at. Symbolically, we're looking at attacking the only thing that is left that's holy in this culture, which is corporate property. It's not that surprising to me, but it's fascinating just how much people freak out about it. And it just reinforces to me that it's actually an important statement to make. Okay, so the third thing that I think Riot says that I'm going to talk about is, I kind of think of it as like flipping dominance or reversing a power relationship. So in Oakland, there was this group called Occupy Patriarchy. It was very interesting. It came out of some people who were regularly training women's martial arts. And in the context of the social movements, when there started to be these regular conflicts with police, Occupy Patriarchy would go and they would sort of, if there was like a clash with police, they would go and they'd run up to the front and they'd be like, boys, get in back. This is women's business, women and queer folks. And they would run up to the front and they would take the shields and they would take the boards and they would intentionally fight police as an empowerment practice. And Oakland always kind of, look at Oakland if you're interested in the United States, because it kind of leads the way. It was there recently. So this was actually from this is actually about the one that I'm going to read you the quote from. At the end of the Occupy movement, people were really having like medieval battles in the streets with police and had these big metal shields. And it was, mostly defensive, notably, but they were sort of refusing to let police dictate the situation. So you can't really see who's in front here. Oh, maybe actually, I can't really read people's genders, but at least at a lot of points, Occupy Patriarchy ran up and made sure that it was queer and women who were in the front of those battles. So I was interested in this, and I was talking to people involved with this, and this is one of the testimonies of why they did that. And it begins, she was at a debate. It begins with her talking about a debate where somebody said kind of what I said earlier, where it's like, riots are violent. Even if it's just property destruction, it's kind of silly to say, breaking things isn't violent. If it's like fire and smashing things, it's violent, but maybe it's a sensible, rational, good kind of violence. So she said, I was like, oh, you're totally right. It's easier to think about, you guys, it's trashing a Starbucks window. What are you complaining about? It's not violence. What about all the violence in the world? I think the real thing is tiny folks from Occupy Patriarchy with our shields, me or whoever, what we're playing with is actually violence. We're scared all the time, and we want to be scary too. We're scared of you. We're going to tell you we're not scared of you anymore. We want to take on feeling tough because we're constantly intimidated by the world in yay number of ways. It's real. And people are playing with it, experimenting. People are trying on being violent or scary, Because at least any female person has the experience of being scared a lot. Whether we feel that way on a day-to-day basis as an adult, we've felt that way in our life. We felt physically intimidated by people. So it's like, oh, I have in my life felt physically intimidated by people. What would it be like to physically intimidate someone else? And I don't think that that's a bad thing. The last one I'm going to talk about, I call this backlighting. It's a term that I came up with. This was a thing that happened at a riot in Seattle that I was at. And this is like the assistant chief of police who decided to take it upon himself to stop this riot of hundreds of people. And he ran into it, and he didn't really stop it. He looks kind of like an idiot. I write about this picture a lot. Notice that people have sort of defensive stances or whatever. People just kind of drove him out. But he looks kind of ridiculous, right? It's kind of like funny. It's like a, I don't know if you know Keystone Cops. It's this sort of like slapstick moment where this guy who's supposed to have all this power is kind of suddenly like, he doesn't seem like he has all that much power. What I was saying about the neoliberal state is, a lot of people talk about how the neoliberal state, like I said, it's like not about justice, it's about control. And one of the central things about that control is it makes it seem like there's no alternative, there's no outside. Margaret Thatcher famously said one time, somebody was like, well, what about alternative programs? And she said, there is no alternative, right? So neoliberalism, in all these different ways, also the way that policing works, surveillance works, we're like constantly like, oh, this lecture is being listened to by 50 different phones, and like we're constantly being watched. That you can't get away with anything because they know what you're doing and they can do anything to you, right? There's this omnipresent, omnipotent feeling of control. And for me, it reminds me of like if I'm sort of dreaming and I just see sort of a seamless wall that extends kind of in all directions and there's no way around it. And then sometimes, somehow, there's like a light that goes on behind that and you're like, oh, it has an edge. It's a finite size, it might be big, but it has a determined size and it has inside and outside, it has edges, and you can get around it. And I think like this picture shows there's ways to sort of embarrass power and show its limitations that happen in these moments of social conflict that I think is part of the point. It shows you can still have agency, you can still do something, even if that's all it shows, even if everything in other ways is silly and dumb, right? It shows that there's still action possible. So with that effect in play, I'm going to read you this last quote before we go to the Q&A that I think kind of plays with this backlighting thing. Somebody else who was active in Oakland said this. I would say the moment when people start fighting the state physically, when people start physicalizing their anger, start striking back at corporations, at symbols of the state, and obviously the police who are like the human embodiment of the state, all that tension, all that violence becomes immediate and becomes visible and physical. And I don't think that's to be underestimated. The chance to be able to physically express and feel that rage, there's not a lot of ways to do it. Shouting, whose streets? Our streets, whose streets? Our streets, when you're at a protest and there's police in front of you and there's police behind you and there's police to this side of you and that side of you, it's silly because they're not your streets. The police are there to make sure that they're not your streets. And that's true in an everyday sense too. The moments when we're willing to fight for the streets and take them is as close as I've ever felt to actually having the streets. It may only last like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. That may be a few hours, but it's in that struggle, I think, that we come the closest. I honestly don't want to say that it's the only form of political expression. That's not what I'm saying at all, but it's a unique form of political expression that brings its own rewards, which are very different from other forms. It has its own risks, it has its own problems, just like all forms of political expression. Thank you.